Well, Hans, the big news of the week is obviously McConnell announcing his retirement. Now, something that I think made an awful lot of people happy. If he was going to actually do the right thing, he'd retire right now. But of course, he's not going to do that. He'll probably continue and act to undermine until November. Um, I guess it opens up a whole host of things. First of all, who's going to replace him? There's going to be a big fight that's going to align around that with guys like Thune, Barrasso, Cornyn all lining up. But it's also interesting timing because this is all set against the backdrop of Ukraine funding, which has really been the ongoing theme. First we had a fake border bill that came out that was, in my mind, designed to fail, but ultimately to get us to funding for Ukraine. That's now pending before the House. And then we had this New York Times article that came out that was disclosing the CIA's operations and was, meant to show everybody how crucial Ukraine is. And that may have worked for some people, but I think for a lot of others, it actually kind of set off a lot more alarm bells. And sort of that, of course the CIA has been there all along and operating. And oh, by the way, if the CIA has been operating there and running all these different bases that they've been running, what did that do as far as playing into the motivation of Putin's actions in Ukraine? Because that obviously presented a threat to him. So there's this whole kind of convoluted backdrop and all these events that are going on. Throw in Russiagate 3.0 into the mix. And all of these things are all intertwined together. They're being presented as separate things, but none of them are really separate. They're all interrelated, intertwined in one big ugly knot.
They are, and I think the CIA article is a sort of a good starting point for this because that takes us, 10 years back. And so what the article said was that the CIA was far more involved in Ukraine than anyone has admitted so far, and this also preceded the coup in Ukraine, the Joe Biden approved coup in February of 2014. So this is very, very important because then that gets into the whole reason why there was a coup, why the U.S. has been like so adamant about supporting Ukraine, money, weapons, whatever. I mean, as you say, a lot of things come together there. But let's kind of just start off you already intimated at this issue of why did the New York Times run that story? Now, it seems pretty clear from what the story actually says that the CIA seeded that story with Adam Entis over there at the New York Times. So they, like they often do, and we've talked about this many times on this show, the intelligence community has their outlets, and then they feed stories to various newspapers, mainly New York Times or Washington Post, depending on where it comes from. And then that sort of establishes the narrative. But I completely agree with your point that this might, the CIA might be a little bit over its skis here, because my reaction initially was like, why would you admit this? How is this going to help you? It's not going to help you with, sort of America First types, which there's of course many, and it probably won't help you with people on the left. Well, not all of them either, because there is a long-standing historical kind of a question mark over CIA. Well, we got to be wary of what they're doing. I mean, just a sort of general wariness. And I kind of specifically, what's the purpose? Why would you admit that? I spent like the first hour thinking that. And then sort of down in the article, you come across a paragraph that tells you why they're doing it. And they're doing it, as you intimated, because they want to pressure Congress into funding Ukraine. They just want to keep this thing going. And so the idea is, we need to keep the funding going because we've been there for so long.
I also think, though, what they're trying to frame this as is a national security issue. So, they've already obviously been raising the specter of Putin, Russia. But now I think they're trying to elevate that a little bit and create this as it's a true national security risk. You guys don't know the full extent of what's going on. That's why we've had the CIA here operating. This is vital to American interests. Because I think the sentiment shift has been, hey, we're sick and fed up. We've got a domestic mess at home. Our borders are a disaster. We're climbing towards 35 trillion in debt. Why are you shifting the focus away? And this may be in part an effort to try and reshape it, not just into funding for Ukraine, but we need to fund for Ukraine because it's a national security risk that, concern that we can't really fully discuss. But I mean, the access that they gave to these reporters is astonishing. Like, what's being reported is the kind of thing that that these same newspaper outlets have gone after other reporters or other whistleblowers for reporting themselves, demanding that they be tossed into jail. The CIA effectively gave these reporters direct access. It's really, it's a pretty astonishing report on some levels, and maybe shows a little bit how desperate they are to get the funding in.
Yeah,
Well, just
absolutely.
real quick, one thing so that people kind of have a little bit of a backdrop to the funding that's going on. We had 115 billion or so that was funded for Ukraine, and this new bill contains another 61 billion in funding. But it's not really quite that simple, because they were utilizing a drawdown of our munition stores, of weapons, etc., to fund Ukraine that was not coming from that 115 billion. So there's no hard numbers, but if I was to hazard a guess, I would think we've probably got at least 200 billion into Ukraine. And there's now a need to replenish our own munition stores. And, that is clearly what part of this bill is for. They keep trying to lever it, but it's also to lay a longer 10-year plan that they haven't really made any great bones about that that's what they want. So, there's a lot of dollars that are moving around in this whole picture, some of it for their own defense company buddies.
Yeah, no, exactly right. There's just so many pieces, so many strands that come together in this one piece and this one story. And as you say, that might even tie in with McConnell, bowing out, if that's the right word. I think what's important to reflect on as well with this, as you say, there's so much detail in there. So, for instance, there were supposedly 12 CIA centers in Ukraine that they established over there. There's what role did these people play in the original coup back in 2014? What role did they play in the Donbass war, which broke out in 2014? What role did they play in seeding the Ukrainian government with people? We know, of course, from that famous tape that Victoria Nuland, with the approval of Joe Biden, had picked the new leader of Ukraine before the coup even happened. She was on the phone with the ambassador saying, "Oh, we want this guy to come in," and who else? And one of the people that might be among the who else is the chief of the Ukrainian intelligence services, who, again, according to that New York Times piece, was already very familiar with his U.S. colleagues by the time of the coup, as if they had been coordinating, ahead of time. And eventually, Poroshenko, who was subsequently actually elected, so it wasn't the original pick from Nuland and Biden. That guy, that was another guy called Yatsenyuk. So when Poroshenko came in, he eventually replaced this head of the Ukrainian intelligence, and it looks like Biden and the other U.S. officials were not very happy about that. Now, why would that be? There's, of course, also this infamous tape where, well, there's many tapes, but one of them where Biden and Poroshenko talk about this. So I think what we can take away from and we can just keep going on and on about all these intricacies that were going on back then. But I think what we can take away from it all is that the U.S. involvement in Ukraine prior to the 2014 coup was much deeper than is widely appreciated. That from that we can deduce that the U.S. involvement in Ukraine after the coup was even deeper than that. And then, of course, that gets us to something that I don't think has been talked about much at all, which is Russiagate 1.0 and the role of Ukraine with that. I mean, we both have had questions about that for, a very, very long time, and pretty much since the start of it back in 2015, 16. So one of the issues that has always bothered me, like really from that time, is why did the Ukrainians come after Paul Manafort? So Paul Manafort was kind of on the periphery of the Trump campaign back in 2015, early 2016. And then in March of 2016, Paul Manafort became the not the campaign manager, but the convention manager, because the campaign manager at the time was still Corey Lewandowski. And eventually Manafort replaced Lewandowski and became the campaign manager. And that's when Ukraine pulled the trigger and released this Black Ledger, which turned out to be false. But anyway, it was New York Times, the whole thing. This was August of 2016, and Manafort was fired. And by the way, coming back to those Poroshenko-Biden tapes, there's a tape of Biden and Poroshenko discussing that and both laughing about it in real time, like, haha, we released that, and now Manafort is gone. I mean, you couldn't have had a more obvious case of election interference than a foreign government releasing a fake ledger to get rid of the campaign manager of the opposition candidate. That's literally what happened here. Anyway, that's a lot of detail. What did you think of that connection with Ukraine, CIA, and Russiagate 1.0? Because, as I said, there's so many things we don't know, but we knew that there was something going on, but we didn't know the details.
Yeah, but before I address that, just one other topic on that, the Black Ledger, the infamous Black Ledger, and it was Sergei Lyshenko, which brought it forth publicly. But what's not very well known about that is our good old friend Nellie Orr, Bruce Orr's wife, Nellie Orr, who was working for Fusion GPS. As far as I know, she is the first person to have gotten information domestically about the Black Ledger. She sent an email to Bruce Orr at the DOJ, along with two other parties at the DOJ that she routinely communicated with. This is while she was working at Fusion GPS. And she had somehow, quote unquote, stumbled across news of the Black Ledger in May of 2016 and sent it into the DOJ, where it then percolated for a while before it gained traction. Then the whispers started over at the New York Times and then the big reporting. But there's a whole nother element that was tied in there. And she pointed fingers at Sergei Lyshenko and said at one point that she actually got it from him. He's denied that. He denied it to me publicly on Twitter. But, there's a lot of weird ropes and pathways that lead back into this. As far as...
Jeff, before I let you go on, there's another one. Steele tasked, dossier author Steele tasked his so-called primary subsource, Igor Danchenko, with finding dirt on Manafort in March of 2016. So immediately as Manafort was appointed as a convention manager. This was before he was hired by Fusion GPS. This was before before the dossier, before all of that. Where did that come from? Sorry, go on. I mean,
well, since we've started on this, there's a whole nother element, and that's Alexandra Chalupa and all the work that she was doing. So she's a American citizen, Ukrainian by nationality, and she was the one that embarked on really targeting Manafort back in late 2015, which, by the way, is around the same time that Nellie Orr started working for Fusion, and she brought in not only the Ukrainian embassy into the picture, which it's like unheard of to have, politicians within Ukraine taking a very, public stance against Trump. But she also started working with Michael Izikov, who later then outed Steele and was working with him on that. And she touched so many different areas. As we said, the Ukrainian embassy, Izikov, State Department was sending emails in. So all of this information on Ukraine was making its way back into these sort of unofficial, official channels from a variety of sources. And I guess that's what kind of brings me back to this article, because when I read that article, I had a couple reactions. My first reaction was, holy crap, 12 different stations? What in the heck? And I guess my secondary reaction was, okay, that actually explains quite a bit. We've had all of these weird Ukraine tendrils that we've are fully aware of, but don't quite have the final reasoning for it. And then suddenly you've got these CIA stations, that they've been very operative over in Ukraine, and it suddenly starts to make a lot more sense. We already knew that the FBI was operating in Ukraine, and that alone, what they were doing was highly suspicious. But as we've kind of joked between us, the FBI is kind of like the idiots of the intelligence community world. And, the CIA, not so much, a little smarter. I would argue that on balance, the CIA has done a lot more harm than good. But, I don't think you can really make the case that they're absolute fools. They're smooth operators, and that they've been there that whole time. It also reminds me of the fact of the way this Latvian intelligence on the Bidens ended up getting black holed. So I guess suddenly when you're reading that and seeing the scale of their operation, which by the way, if they're disclosing that much to us, we don't know the full scale, right? I think you can extrapolate out whatever they're telling us, it's a lot more. And if that's the case, well, what were those puppet masters doing? I mean, that's kind of their job, is play puppet master. What were they actually doing in the background, and how big of a role did they play in all this? How much of this was directed by them?
Right, and this gets us back to the what Bill Barr said, which was that the CIA stayed in its lane. That was his conclusion in respect of Russiagate 1.0. And that never passed the smell test. And I think, this latest news only reinforces that it never passed the smell test. Now, you mentioned the Ukrainian politicians getting involved in the 2016 election. I completely agree. At the time, I had never ever seen anything like it, that a foreign country is so partisan in respect of another country's election. It's just something you don't do. You can't do that. It's just, you don't do that in international relations. So for instance, you had the Ukrainian ambassador in Washington penning an op-ed. Was it in The Hill? I think it was in The Hill.
It was in The Hill. I'm looking at it right here. It was Chile.
Anti-Trump. You had the Ukrainian prime minister on Facebook just lambasting Trump. Now, this is all during the election. And there was even if you went by the polls, there was a possibility that Trump might win. So no sane country would ever do that, even if the possibility is 20%, or what did the New York Times say, 8%, 10%, doesn't matter. It's a real possibility that might happen. Of course, in the end, it did happen. So why would you burn those bridges like crazy? What's the purpose? And when I read that article, one of the first things that came to mind was like, this is why they burned the bridges. They were told to burn the bridges because, as I said, no sane person would ever do that. You don't even some hostile regime doesn't come up and their politicians start saying all kinds of bad things about your political candidates during the campaign, because what if they win? You end up, first of all, it's not diplomatic. Just don't do it. It's not the norm. But second of all, just as a practical matter, what if they win? Which is what happened here. So my first thought was, given how embedded the CIA was, and given how embedded John Brennan in particular was, that he was so involved with the security chief over there, the intelligence chief over there, and even prior to 2014, and all this kind of the fact that it was also interwoven, just made me think the Ukrainians must have been pretty confident that the CIA had its back in order to, go and push such a, destructive narrative about Trump. Which of course then backfired because Trump won.
Yeah, and this was their ambassador, Valerie Chile, who literally took the time out to write an op-ed, and he did it late. It was in August of 2016. I think it was the very beginning. And, it was basically resetting the narrative that Trump was working for Russia and that Trump was going to have, take a bad stance in regards to Crimea, et cetera. And that, as you said, that always, from the very get-go, that immediately smelled wrong. What in the heck is going on that an ambassador to the U.S. from another country would take a stance like that and take it so publicly that he put it into print? It wasn't just comments, that he wrote a full op-ed that was glamorized throughout the U.S. Yes, they must have felt very, very confident. And really that showed, because when Trump won, there was an awful lot of backpedaling from Ukrainian diplomats. And, that's when Trump early on reached out to Zelensky on all this stuff. So it's kind of, that article sort of brought all this and sort of made it make sense that there was some direction. Now, I still don't know that we have the complete answer as to why that direction was being implied. And we also, you mentioned Brennan. Brennan was very clearly working with other intel officials. He wasn't working with Five Eyes in the sense that's been written about. It wasn't an official stance. He was working with high-level contacts, basically people he knew in the intelligence world, to kind of get this desired outcome that Trump is bad and Trump is colluding with Russia. But nevertheless, he had these willing participants from parties that you wouldn't think would normally do so. And, again, now we see from very early on, I always thought Brennan was one of the major architects. Maybe that's a little too big of a statement for him, but one of the directors, like the guy that was doing the real groundwork of laying all this. And, now that we know that there's these 12 different stations, it certainly makes an awful lot more sense.
It certainly does. And there's also the events after Trump won. The Obama administration had kind of 2 months to clean up their mess. And one of the things they did, of course, which we talked about before, is the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment, which they hung around Trump's neck. That was the totally made up assessment, which claimed that Putin had helped Trump win. Now, if you're the incoming president, and that's hung around your neck, that's like an albatross. That's just going to be so destructive. And that's exactly what it was. And it was all made up. And one of the things that Brennan kept claiming about that is, it's not Steele, it's not the dossier. There's the super secret source. Well, we never found out what that super secret source was. And it does make me think again, as you say, we don't have all the answers, but it does make me think again, especially with this new article, what's the Ukraine connection there? Remember, we also have Yuri Shvets. That's such an interesting story in and of itself. So Yuri Shvets is a Ukrainian guy, supposedly a former intelligence official, and it was reported by people in Ukraine during 2016. This is very, very important. It wasn't like some guy Monday morning quarterbacking in 2017 or whatever. In 2016, it was reported that there was this guy called Yuri Shvets who was in Ukraine trying to come up with dirt stories against Trump on behalf of Clinton. We checked the archives, we checked that this was really published at the time, and it really, really was. So what's this guy's connection to, say, Ukrainian intelligence? How does that tie back in with Brennan? I mean, we just don't know. There's so many unknowns. But the mere fact that we now, well, I wouldn't say we know because it's a New York Times article, but put it this way, the mere fact that the CIA now admits that they were deeply embedded in Ukraine much earlier and much deeper than anyone knew does open up all those questions. And then, sorry to go on here, but the other one, I mean, there's just so many things that suddenly come back out of the woodwork. The other one, of course, is Fancy Bear.
Yes,
that to me is a huge part of that New York Times story, which I don't think many people realize it as such. But it's almost kind of mentioned as an aside. So Fancy Bear is this group of Russian hackers. And very importantly, Fancy Bear was accused of being involved with this DNC hack back in June of 2016, where the emails came out that showed that the DNC had put its thumb on the scale in favor of Clinton and against Bernie Sanders. That was sort of the main import of that. It got blown up into this huge thing. Russia hacked the DNC, by the way, for which there is no evidence other than the Fancy Bear, which we'll come back to in a moment. But I don't want to get into all the details of CrowdStrike, everything that went down there, but that's the basic outline of the story. Russia hacked the DNC. Never mind that the story was really about Bernie Sanders and not really about Trump. And, anyway, that's
and
what we're
never
stuck
mind
with.
that there was
How
no
often have we
proof
heard
that Russia did so.
Adam Schiff and Dan Goldman and Nancy Pelosi, everyone, Russia hacked the DNC. Well, Fancy Bear, right? So Fancy Bear are the guys who are supposed to have done that. Right? And so this has been a huge kind of puzzle for you and I for years and years. And, we know that's not, we know that Russia probably did not hack the DNC, or at least there's no evidence for that. But we've never been sort of quite able to figure it out. Suddenly there's the New York Times article about the CIA in Ukraine, and it mentions that the Ukrainian security services had infiltrated, or words to that effect, Fancy Bear. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't say that the DNC hack was falsely attributed to Fancy Bear. That would be sort of the next step. It doesn't say that, but at least it allows us to start thinking in that direction.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought about, when you mentioned that the Obama regime had a couple months to kind of clean things up, I always sort of drift back to Evelyn Farkas and her comments that were sort of off the cuff to MSNBC when she was talking about the information that was being disseminated on Trump, all of which was done to handcuff him. And, she said something to the effect of, if they knew how we got the information that we got, the sources and methods, it would be a problem. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's effectively what she said. And this all goes back to what you were talking about. Is once Trump won, then the real cover up began to cover up their own tracks on everything they'd done. And they had those 2 months in which to do it, but then they established a pattern of keeping Trump from being so handcuffed he wasn't able to operate at all. So there was no chance for him to do anything on that front for, another year, basically. All designed to hide things. And now, we're with this information about the CIA operations, you're starting to think that they're hiding much bigger things than maybe we'd even thought that they had been hiding. And, your discussion about Fancy Bear, that, a whole host of new questions there. Although we've always suspected that, as you said, there's no evidence that Russia actually did that. I think it's probably fair to say we both always thought that was not true, and probably think just that much more now that it's not true. I keep waiting for kind of the next shoe to drop on that. We know there's some information that's being worked on out there, but once you come back to their thirst for the funding for Ukraine and to keep this going, and you think about the involvement that they, literally made a regime change in 2014, that they were then operating there, and the magnitude that we hadn't realized was present, the way that they used Ukraine as a means to try to alter the election through various parts that are now starting to come together a little bit, it's raising larger questions in many respects. Like, wait a minute, just exactly what is really going on there? At least to me, it's starting to feel a lot larger even than it had, and it already felt pretty large. But
and
now
did you see Walker Fire's tweet? Someone dug it up from years ago, and it got like a big response again. Now years later, and that tweet, of course, was that kind of something along the lines: if you're wondering what all this fascination with Ukraine is, and this endless money and so on, think of all the things they know that happened over there in 2015 and 16. And I thought that was so prescient of our friend Walker Fire to have put that out, a long time ago. And it's all come back and proven to be, likely true. That is at least part of the reason. They were always being told Russia and the war and so on. There were many opportunities to end the war. There were many opportunities to not even start the war. I mean, there's no reason for Joe Biden to go over there in December of 2021 and proclaim, that Ukraine would be a NATO member, or words to that effect. It's so many things. I mean, we could just go on and on about all the things that could have been done not to have a war, to stop the war, how Boris Johnson scuppered the peace plan, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not saying this whole thing is only about covering up the CIA's involvement in Ukraine. I mean, that's sort of too simple. Like many things in life, it's multi-causal, and different people have different incentives. Just like with COVID, lots of people have different incentives for covering it up. They just all happen to be going in the same direction. So a lot of people have the same incentive to keep funding Ukraine and to keep whatever's over there quiet, for, again, various incentives. So, Russia is certainly a big incentive. There's no question about that. But let's not discount the fact, as Walker Fire suggested, that keeping, certain things over there in terms of information is also very, very important. And that brings me to some other people like Andrei Telizhenko and Andrei Derkach. Derkach is the guy who released the Biden Poroshenko tapes. Telizhenko is the guy who did nothing. I mean, he was like just a staff member at the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. Maybe he just tweeted too much. Maybe his tweet suggested that he was actually a Trump supporter, maybe. But those guys were all sanctioned. And they were basically shut up. Those guys who could have had some information, I mean, Telizhenko, for instance, would have had information about Hunter and Blue Star and so on, but, everyone was shut up. So anyway, long story short is I would not underestimate the amount of influence in this whole situation, the funding situation, and this crazy interest in Ukraine that is motivated by just keeping things quiet, by shutting people up.
Yeah, and it's also Telizhenko, by the way. I mean, there's a lot of things that we wouldn't have known without him. because he divulged a lot of things that were going on. He crossed paths multiple times with Chalupa, saw what she was doing, saw the pressure that was being placed on the Ukrainian embassy to take a stance against Trump. He reported on that until he was shut up. But the thing that I keep coming back to, you'd mentioned kind of, we've talked about the CIA, et cetera, and what Ukraine knew, and the fact that maybe they have to be, sort of effectively kept happy to keep the information from coming out. Well, I also kind of come back to the other element of that, and that is the fact that the CIA, they had to know everything that Joe Biden was doing over there. So everything that he was engaging with Ukraine, all the activities that he was taking with Burisma, with removing the prosecutor, despite what people said, that he was actually taking a stance that went against the official State Department stance on Ukraine in terms of providing the funding, the taxpayer loan guarantees. State Department had approved that, said Ukraine had made enough progress on corruption, et cetera. Biden reversed that. Well, we knew the CIA was we knew the FBI was somewhat involved with that, at least towards the end, late 2015 and into 2016. But now we know the CIA was there the whole time. And it's utterly implausible that the CIA wasn't aware of every single aspect that Joe and Hunter Biden were doing in Ukraine. So that's kind of a whole nother, important overlay to keep around this.
Right. You mentioned the money laundering, just as an example, for instance. So Latvian authorities, and that's EU, that's European Union territory. There's, the guy in charge of that was a guy called Burkhans, he was in charge of the Latvian anti-money laundering authority. This guy's not embroiled in big corrupt schemes in Ukraine or whatever. He's just a guy in Latvia, different country, different things, just kind of doing his job. So they came across these payments that were funneled from Ukraine to Hunter Biden, and that was a big red flag, and he flagged it up. So without getting into all the details, it was then shut down by the Ukrainians. So like, no, just ignore that. Nothing to worry here. But this is just one example of this is the kind of stuff the CIA would absolutely certainly have known about. If the anti-money laundering authority in Latvia informs Ukrainian authorities that Hunter Biden is involved in money laundering, which is what happened, or suspected of being involved, then the CIA knows about that. So that's just one example there. But of course, many other things they knew as well. Now, I would, on the FBI side, I would add something, again, cover up, very kind of underreported. One of the Biden-Poroshenko tapes is from the period after Trump was elected, but while Biden was still vice president. Now, we mentioned this guy, Dirk Hatch, earlier. What happened was that he released those tapes much later, I think in 2020. But what happened back in 2016, after Trump won, is that the tapes were taken to the FBI as kind of a whistleblower. I think this was an attempt by some Ukrainians to curry favor because they might not know exactly, they might not have known how anti-Trump the FBI was or whatever. I think someone was trying to wash their hands preemptively, trying to CYA themselves preemptively. And what happened is that Poroshenko got wind of that. He got wind of the fact that his assistant had taken these things to the FBI. So he warned Biden about it on the phone. He said, "Hey, Biden, there was these tapes of us that were delivered to the FBI. That's not good, And then Biden goes, to the obviously
Biden was remarkably calm, wasn't he?
Don't worry about it. It's been taken care of.
Yep.
Just that in itself could be like the scandal of the decade, and yet hardly anyone's ever heard about it. So once again, we have cover up after Trump was elected to do with Ukraine. The same pattern again and again and again. What were they hiding?
Well, maybe just there's a short story that maybe I'd like to relay that's worth see what you think about it. But it's always puzzled me why the FBI suddenly decided to set up shop at NABU, which was the new anti-corruption division in Ukraine that actually was initiated by Joe Biden, believe it or not. He was pushing them to set up the special division. It was this fledgling unit. And all of a sudden, out of the nowhere, the FBI comes into the picture in very late 2015, and by early January 2016, they've got an FBI representative on site. They build that, and by June, they have a formal office. There's a memorandum of understanding that the FBI has literally gone to court to prevent anybody from seeing what's actually behind that document. But the document itself exists. We've got copies of it. So there was this sudden, out of nowhere, formal presence of the FBI at Nabu. And indeed, that is where the corruption allegations, the money laundering allegation from Latvia went to. Those came out, I believe it was in February 2016.
Correct.
And it was considered to be highly credible allegations of money laundering involving, I believe it was 4 officials at Burisma, including Hunter Biden and 2 Americans, is how it was phrased. And they made no bones about it, that it was money laundering allegations. And there's a little added detail to that, is that the bank that was involved in this money laundering allegations was a Ukrainian bank called Privat Bank. And Privat Bank just so happens to be a bank that comes up in one of those recordings that you mentioned between Biden and Poroshenko. And this is now after Trump has won, but while Joe Biden is still technically vice president. And he is on those tapes basically threatening Poroshenko to make sure that Privat Bank is closed. Again, think about that. The allegations from Latvia of money laundering, the money was going through Privat Bank. After Trump wins, Biden gets on the phone with Poroshenko and is pushing Poroshenko to close Privat Bank. The reason I started all this with, I've always been puzzled with why the FBI suddenly pushed their way into Nabu and were there kind of seemingly out of the blue. Makes a lot more sense if you know that the CIA was on the ground full in force and, was aware of this information probably before anybody else, and perhaps brought the FBI into place to manage the release of that information.
Yeah, no, exactly. But once again, it's the same story where you have U.S. government far more deeply involved, entangled, embedded in Ukraine, and that touches on so many topics. I mean, it touches on the topic of the coup, it touches on the topic of the war, it touches on the war on the topic of basically running Ukraine. This is another issue that's hardly ever talked about. The extent to which the U.S. government was micromanaging Ukrainian affairs ever since 2014 was literally like treating it like a colony. Down to, we have some emails where, Joe Biden, one of his excuses for no, he didn't want to fire the prosecutor. He just wanted to, rearrange that whole office. The prosecutor getting fired was like general policy, that whole story. But if you leave the prosecutor aside, there's stuff in there about how exactly they're supposed to structure their office, and then you're supposed to install this inspector general, and they're supposed to follow this model and that model, and that's just one little tiny piece out of this whole big catalog of things they were doing. And it just always surprises me, well, not surprises, but shocks me, I really should say, that the level of micromanaging that was going on over there. And no one's bothered. All these anti-colonialist people who always protest and scream about everything, and they're not bothered about that at all. So, and then that leads into, well, if you're micromanaging everything, did you micromanage the Ukrainian effort to derail the Trump candidacy in 2016?
Exactly.
It appears that that's what happened. Did you then micromanage the cover-up of your efforts to derail the Trump candidacy in 2016? Well, that appears what happens. And then, of course, did you also micromanage everything that happened after that? That means covering up the Hunter Biden scandal, covering up everything to do with Trump's very reasonable request for Ukraine to look into that issue, Trump's impeachment. Just the list goes on. And then, of course, leading into the 2022 war. There is so much there that we've just literally just touched upon the surface, and just from the amount of things that we've picked out here as examples, just kind of shows you how incredibly bad the situation is and how completely entangled the situation is. And again, we've barely touched upon it, and we don't have all the answers. That's the most frustrating thing. But to come back to where we started off from, the mere fact that it's now confirmed that the CIA was so deeply embedded over there for over 10 years does at least provide a path to getting all the answers that we're looking for.
I mentioned Nabu earlier, and you talked about the way that there was a restructuring of the prosecutor's office. Well, really, there was a parallel effort by the establishment of Nabu, because Nabu was effectively to dilute and in many respects take over much of what was being handled out of the Ukraine prosecutor's office. And again, the establishment of that, it took them a little while to get it up and running, but the establishment of Nabu really came at a push from none other than Joe Biden. So if you have the CIA in the background of that, raises all kinds of questions. Something else that just kind of popped into my head while I was thinking about it. As far as Burisma, there was another kind of famous individual that was on the board of directors that most people, it doesn't get enough conversation about, but maybe has sudden more relevance. And that's Cofer Black. A former CIA official who just happens to be on the board of directors at Burisma at the time that Hunter joins the board of Burisma. It always was very strange and smelled, but suddenly that has a whole nother level of questions. And I always figured that it was probably pretty likely that he might have been one of those people caught up in the money laundering allegations, because Latvia was very specific. Hunter Biden, Devon Archer, and 2 other Americans, I think was the exact phrasing. Like they named names. But they made it clear that there was a couple other Americans that were involved with Burisma that were involved with that. Well, to my knowledge, there was very limited other American officials that were involved with Burisma, and Cofer's one of them. And he just so happens to be a former CIA official, and we now know that the CIA was running major operations in Ukraine. The whole thing just stinks to high heaven. And Ukraine's always been it's an oligarch-run nation, right? It's like Zelensky's not really the boss; he's got his own boss. It's always been run by oligarchs. The owner of Burisma was an oligarch. Well, if the CIA was operating the entire time, those guys are notorious for controlling the oligarchs. And if the oligarchs were effectively running Ukraine, and the CIA, their whole specialty is controlling those oligarchs, there's the possibility of a really extensive level of control that was being exercised over Ukraine the entire time. That goes, how much of the politics were they directing? A lot of questions get raised.